done to children in Canada. You have to be able to put that hat on and think about what would be said about that as an act of terrorism.
It's worth remembering that in occupied Western Europe during the Second World War, the Nazi term for the resistance to their occupation was terrorist. Nelson Mandela was labeled a terrorist by the apartheid regime of South Africa. Now, what has been happening since 9/11, what has been enabled by 9/11, is in part a deliberate reversion to pre-Enlightenment forms of justice and jurisprudence. I mean, think, for example, of the Fifth Amendment to the American Constitution, right? The amendment against self-incrimination. What's that there for? That amendment is there so that you cannot be forced by agents of the state into a confession, into self-incrimination. It is explicitly a response to the pre-Enlightenment forms of legal investigation, in which one of the first things you do is to torture someone. In other words, and the function of torture is very deliberately to put the state's language into the mouth of the accused, so that you are made to speak someone else's words. And the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is there as an obstruction to that kind of process. Now, in a bizarre manner, the jurisprudence of the War on Terror is a reversion to pre-Enlightenment Europe. One of the great, I think it's really an unequaled historical scandal, because other cultures didn't experience this same thing, was the Western European witch hunts of the 16th and 17th century. Don't think that witch hunting was something that happened in the medieval period. It wasn't. It didn't happen then. It happened. It began in the late 15th century. It developed into a major scourge around 1560 in the 16th century. And the really appalling, the horrifying, the mass witch hunts are a feature of the 17th century. They coincide in many parts of Europe with the horrendous effects of the 30 Years' War in Germany and elsewhere. Now, one feature of that structure was the dissemination by authorities within Western Europe of a mythology that said, we are under threat by immensely powerful demonic agents who have recruited all kinds of people into effectively sleeper cells, and we must act against them by abandoning all of the previously understood legal precautions that were built in a fairly inadequate way into the legal codes of the time, because what we are facing is what Latin jurists of the Renaissance called a crimen exceptum. This is a crime beyond the borders of any normal criminality, and therefore we have to respond to it by, as Dick Cheney would say, going to the dark side. Right? In other words, we throw aside any restraint, and what we are, of course, the obvious result of that kind of throwing aside of restraint was that you produced cascades of multiplying accusations and incrimination. You take one person, you torture him into confessing that all his neighbors are witches, and so on and so on and so on. Right? Now, we are in the process of replicating those structures in this appalling reversion to a pre-Enlightenment mindset and a pre-Enlightenment set of practices in this fraudulent war on terror.
If you read the report of the 9/11 Commission, the crucial parts of that document, which determine who the criminals were mostly obtained under torture. and we have statistics on this. The footnotes have been studied in detail. You look at all this crucial information about who did what and which of the 19 terrorists did, and you look in the footnote, KSM, September 1st. That means Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was tortured, and his confession supposedly said this, this, and this, with no corroborating evidence, and we're not even allowed to see the document that he supposedly produced. The 9/11 Commission wasn't even allowed to meet with him or view the tapes or anything.
Or to meet with his torturers.
Right.
And then the tapes were destroyed.
So
by the CIA.
Talk about a parallel to the witch hunts.
Well, I'm going to give my parallel here. This is one of the most famous documents of the Enlightenment, which is the American Declaration of Independence, issued on July the 4th, 1776. And I call attention to this often, but I don't see other people calling attention to it, so I'm just going to persist. So this is the text of the American Declaration of Independence, where we see these famous phrases about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then we get into an indictment against King George III. Students at the other end will have heard this, but who knows who's listening to this either now or at some other time. So this reference speaks to King George. King George is he. King George has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And that seems to me to be a perfect rendition of the idea that the merciless Indian savages are terrorists. They do violence in unpredictable ways. They inflict violence arbitrarily on civilians, on women, on children, on elders. So isn't it interesting to find that the United States is founded on principle that the people sitting on the land that is going to be the
example of the operation of projecting onto, in this case, the first peoples, projecting onto them what the United States themselves is doing to them as their major crime. Because in fact, they didn't do this. We don't see an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. I mean, I don't know of too many cases where that happens from the first peoples, but we know that that happened on a systematic basis of extermination to them. So they're being blamed for what their oppressors are doing to them as a justification for it. That operation is the one that I find most sort of mind-boggling, and that it is going on now for 200 years, and it still goes on. Like, I mean, just the wording. It applies really only to the occupying powers.
And and of course the merciless Indian savages just happen to be sitting on the resources that the United States is being created to absorb. You know, it's wants to push beyond the British imperial restrictions to expansion into the interior and the privatization and transformation of the interior of the United States into capital. Into new capital.
Money sequencing.
Yeah. I would.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing like in Britain. Like members of the Conservative Party used to walk around wearing "Hang Mandela" T-shirts, you know, and they didn't care. But I mean, what it comes down to is what we're discussing is that terrorism is the warfare of the weak and powerless, and warfare is the terrorism of the strong and powerful. And if we think of it through that mindset, then yeah, I mean, like. In Dr. Hall's book, he talks about Tecumseh. Well, Tecumseh would have been a terrorist, against capitalism at that time. And I think of when Rosa Luxemburg said, humanity had a choice between socialism or barbarism. And it seems like we're choosing the former rather than the latter in the current day. And when we put it in the Canadian context and look at the witch hunts of the modern day against halal meat or the hijab, or in Holland they banned the burqa for 100 women who wore the full burqa. They demonized them and enshrined the law to say, well, no, there's something other. And it reminds me of, that in Nazi Germany, Frei Müller said, you know, they came for the communists, I was not a communist, so I did nothing. They came for the Jews, I was not a Jew, so I did nothing. They came for the trade unionists, I was not a trade unionist, so I did nothing. And then they came for me. And, you know, if we think of it that way, that's why we have to stand in solidarity with Muslim students, Arab students, with, you know, the new despised minority which is being induced, because, you know, it could be, who knows who will be the next ones, you know. It used to be the native people in South Africa, and then they emancipated themselves and so on. So, I mean, that's why I think we're talking about in the Canadian context. Well, yeah, when there is this war on the burqa, or a war on the hijab, or war on halal meat, or we're locking people up for terrorists, by state terrorists, you know, and we have to illuminate this hypocrisy, otherwise nothing's going to ever be, you know, we won't drag ourselves back into post-Enlightenment thought, will we? I mean,
I'd say if I can, this isn't a direct follow-up to that, I think, really splendidly lucid intervention. But one of the things that's at issue, and this goes back to the question that was raised a few minutes ago, of national sovereignty. Our government permits the agents of a foreign state to swan around on our soil fully armed and ready to use those weapons. Right? This has been formally permitted by the Conservative government. Now, it was discovered, it came to light, I think, on the Six Nations Reserve at Brantford, when the Six Nations police arrested some suspicious-looking people who were roaring around in an SUV, and they turned out to be BATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agents from the United States. What were they doing, fully armed, in this country? And furthermore, on Six Nations land. So there's a double violation of sovereignty, but a violation of sovereignty clearly winked at and permitted by our own government. Now, that's a very supine kind of stance on the part of anything presuming to call itself a national government. Oh yes, we don't mind if your police agents move around through our population fully armed, and of course ready to use those weapons. Moreover, we don't mind if we have some sort of emergency, and this is what our government now accepts. We don't mind Northern Command forces, in other words, American forces, intervening in our territory to deal with the situation. Now, that's a complete abdication of sovereignty.
I'd like to say something now, because I feel we're, although I agree with all this, going down a path of extreme negativity here. And as we come toward the end of this, I'm trying to think of anything good that we might say, not in a Pollyanna sense, but perhaps that can give us some realistic hope. In talking about Canada, since that's the theme, and media in Canada, I just wanted to say that I have been interviewed on the radio several times, but twice really well done in Canada. Usually it's by small radio stations, in my experience.
Yeah.
You know, a little town of this, a little town of that. And also when I was in the United States, in Montana, State Montana Radio did a great interview. And then, perhaps not a breakthrough, but an interesting thing that happened was when Michael and I were recently on TV Ontario, Steve Pakin's show, The Agenda. And, you know, I went with Barry Zwicker to make the pitch that Steve Pakin should have us on the show, and he listened. And he said he would think about it and that he was interested. And you know what? He did it. I may not think the show was perfect. I may, you know, wish I'd said this instead of this, or that he had perhaps given us a little more time. It was quite rushed. But the fact is, I think he was fair. So I think that there are opportunities when it comes to 9/11 for us to talk about this issue, that we shouldn't give up. I mean, I tend to be pretty cynical, frankly, So that probably without the urging of other people, I wouldn't have gotten involved in any of those initiatives. But in retrospect,